The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kepler Academy, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Students from dozens of worlds moved through the corridors in their designated groups, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and telepathic hums that had become background noise to anyone who had spent more than a week at the galaxy's most prestigious interspecies educational institution. Sarah Martinez walked among them, her worn leather backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unremarkable in every way that mattered. At 17, she possessed the kind of forgettable features that made her blend seamlessly into any crowd. Brown hair that she kept in a simple ponytail, average height, clothes that were clean but clearly not expensive. The only thing that might have caught attention was how she unconsciously adjusted her path to avoid the more aggressive species. But even that seemed like normal human caution. The Kepler Academy had been established 50 years ago as a symbol of galactic unity, bringing together the brightest young minds from the confederated worlds. Each species sent their most promising students, future diplomats, scientists, and leaders who would shape interstellar relations for generations to come. The application process was so competitive that entire planets might only have one student accepted per cycle. Sarah had been one of 3 humans accepted this term, though she often wondered if there had been some kind of administrative error. Her grades were good but not exceptional. Her family background was thoroughly middle class, and she had no particular talents that would set her apart from billions of other human teenagers. Yet here she was, sitting in advanced xenobiology, alongside the heir to the Vegan trade empire, and a young crystalline whose mathematical proofs had already been published in major academic journals. Professor Kethvar, a tall mantis-like being from the hive worlds, clicked his way to the front of the classroom. His compound eyes surveyed the mixed group of students with the kind of patient attention that had made him famous across the galaxy for his work in cross-species education theory. Today, we begin our study of human physiology, Kethvar announced, his translator rendering his clicking speech into perfect standard galactic. As you know, humans are among the newer species to join our galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 200 years ago. Yet in that brief time, they have established themselves as valuable members of our confederation. Several students turned to look at the 3 humans in the class. Marcus, a tall boy from the Europa colonies, straightened proudly. Elena, whose parents were both diplomatic attachés, smiled politely. Sarah simply continued taking notes, trying to ignore the attention. What makes humans particularly interesting from a biological standpoint, Kethvar continued, pulling up a holographic display of human anatomy, is their remarkable adaptability. Unlike most species which evolved in specific environmental niches, humans developed as persistence hunters on a world with extreme climate variations. This has given them several unique characteristics. The professor highlighted the human cardiovascular system. Note the robust circulatory system, capable of functioning efficiently in a wide range of atmospheric conditions. The respiratory system can process gases that would be toxic to many species. Most remarkably, humans possess what we call emergency physiology, the ability to temporarily exceed their normal physical limitations when threatened. A draconian student, her scales shimmering blue-green in the classroom light, raised a clawed hand. Professor, surely these adaptations are not so unusual? Many predator species have similar capabilities. An excellent question, Sixandra, Kethvar replied. The difference lies in the degree and controllability. Most species have specific triggers for emergency responses. Humans seem capable of consciously accessing these states, and their emergency physiology is far more dramatic than typical. They can continue functioning with injuries that would incapacitate most beings, ignore pain that would render others unconscious, and demonstrate strength levels that exceed their baseline capabilities by several 100%. Sarah's pen stopped moving across her tablet. She had heard variations of this lecture before, but something about the way Professor Kethvar spoke made her feel like he was describing alien creatures rather than her own species. She had never experienced anything like what he was describing. The most dramatic thing that had ever happened to her was passing out during a particularly intense fitness test last year. Of course, the professor continued, these are generalizations based on historical records and laboratory studies. Individual humans vary considerably in their capabilities, and many never experience these emergency states in controlled environments. The crystalline student, whose name was something unpronounceable that roughly translated to harmonic resonance of the third frequency, chimed softly. Are there documented cases of humans exceeding these baseline emergency responses? Kethavar's antennae twitched, and what Sarah had learned was his species' equivalent of a smile. There are stories, legends really, tales of individual humans performing feats that seem to exceed even their remarkable emergency physiology, lifting objects that should have been physically impossible, surviving in environments that should have been instantly fatal, demonstrating reaction times that approach precognitive levels. But these are largely considered myths. Myths with an interesting pattern, added a new voice from the back of the classroom. Everyone turned to see Dr. Yilan, the Academy's head of xenopsychology, standing in the doorway. The elderly Centaurian's forearms were folded across his chest, and his large, dark eyes held an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. Dr. Yilan, Cathvar acknowledged. We weren't expecting you. My apologies for the interruption, Dr. Yilan said, moving into the classroom with the flowing grace typical of his species. I wanted to speak with the class about an administrative matter. We're updating our student database, and there seems to be some confusion with our records. He produced a data tablet and began reading names. Marcus Chen Williams, registration confirmed. Elena Vasquez Santos, registration confirmed. His eyes found Sarah in the middle of the room. Sarah Martinez. The way he said her name made something cold settle in Sarah's stomach. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. Yes, sir, she responded, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. Dr. Yilan studied her for a long moment. There seems to be a discrepancy in your file. Your enrollment application lists your name as Sarah Martinez, but our automated systems have flagged an alternative designation in our security database. The classroom had gone completely silent. Even the Hiveworld students, who typically maintained a constant low-level telepathic hum, had gone quiet. I'm not sure what you mean, Sarah said, though her heart was beginning to beat faster for reasons she couldn't explain. Dr. Yilan's expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed that his secondary arms had moved to rest near the emergency communication device on his belt. According to our records, he said carefully, you're also listed under the designation Wraith 7. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah stared at Dr. Yilan, genuinely confused, but around her, she began to notice that several of the alien students had gone very still in ways that suggested they recognized the name. I've never heard that name before in my life, Sarah said, and she was telling the absolute truth. Dr. Yilan nodded slowly, but his hand remained near his communication device. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office. Dr. Yilan's office occupied an entire corner of the administration building, its walls lined with artifacts from dozens of worlds and filled with the soft, ambient lighting preferred by his species. Sarah sat in a chair that had automatically adjusted to human proportions, while Dr. Yilan moved around his desk with deliberate, measured steps. Sarah, he began, settling into his own chair, I want you to understand that you're not in any trouble. However, the name Wraith 7 has certain implications that we need to discuss. Sarah clasped her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. Dr. Yilan, I honestly don't know what that name means. I've never heard it before today. I believe you, he said, which surprised her, but that creates an even more concerning situation. He activated a privacy field around his office, and Sarah felt a subtle tingling as the quantum barriers engaged. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of galactic security. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah had never been involved in anything that could remotely be considered classified. 30 years ago, Dr. Yilan continued, during the border wars with the hegemony, human military forces demonstrated capabilities that troubled many of our allies, not because they were aggressive or threatening, but because they exceeded every projection we had made about human potential. Sarah nodded, though she was already lost. Her history classes had covered the border wars only briefly, describing them as a series of territorial disputes that had been resolved through diplomatic intervention. The official records speak of human courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds, Dr. Yilan said. What they don't mention is how a small number of human operatives accomplished things that our best military analysts still consider impossible. He gestured to his desk, and a holographic display materialized showing star charts with various markers and tactical symbols. The hegemony had established a fortress on Kepler 442b, a world that controlled 3 major hyperspace routes. The planet was considered impregnable. Atmospheric storms that could tear apart starships, gravity nearly 3 times standard, and an ecosystem filled with predators that had evolved to hunt in packs. The hegemony had spent 50 years turning it into a military stronghold with enough firepower to hold off a fleet. The hologram zoomed in on a dark, storm-racked world that looked like something from a nightmare. 7 human operatives infiltrated that world. Dr. Yilan continued quietly. They destroyed the entire hegemony installation, eliminated a garrison of over 10,000 troops, and captured or destroyed enough military hardware to end the border wars. All 7 operatives survived and extracted successfully. Sarah stared at the image, trying to process what she was hearing. That seems extremely difficult, but humans have accomplished remarkable things before. I don't understand why this would be classified. Dr. Yilan's large eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Sarah, those 7 operatives didn't use any advanced technology. No powered armor, no heavy weapons, no orbital support. They infiltrated on foot, lived off the land for 6 months, and accomplished their mission using nothing but basic equipment and their own capabilities. That's... Sarah struggled to find words. That's impossible. Yes, Dr. Yilan agreed. It should have been. Yet our sensors recorded everything. The operatives demonstrated reaction times that approached the theoretically impossible, strength levels that exceeded even the emergency physiology Professor Kethvar described, and most remarkably, they seemed to operate with a level of coordination and tactical awareness that suggested some form of shared consciousness. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the privacy field. Sarah felt like she was floating outside of herself, listening to a story about aliens rather than members of her own species. After the war ended, Dr. Yilan continued, the Galactic Council quietly requested that the human government provide more information about these operatives. The response was interesting. What did they say? Nothing, Dr. Yilan replied. The human government claimed to have no record of the mission, no knowledge of the operatives, and no explanation for what had occurred. They suggested that perhaps our intelligence had been flawed, or that the hegemony garrison had been evacuated before some kind of natural disaster destroyed their installation. Sarah frowned. But you said you had sensor records. We did. We also had testimony from hegemony survivors, physical evidence, and detailed tactical analysis. But the human government maintained that no such operatives existed. Dr. Yilan leaned forward, his secondary arms folded across his chest. However, intelligence sources within the human military structure eventually provided us with a single piece of information. The operatives were part of a program so classified that even most human government officials didn't know about it. They were designated by numbers rather than names. Wraith 1 through Wraith 7. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. You think I'm one of them? I think the human government went to extraordinary lengths to hide the existence of these individuals, Dr. Yilan said carefully. Creating false identities, false histories, and false memories would not be beyond their capabilities. And it would explain how a seemingly ordinary human teenager managed to gain admission to the galaxy's most competitive academic institution despite having no apparent exceptional qualifications. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the academy's central courtyard. Students from a dozen worlds were moving between classes, going about their normal lives, while she was apparently discovering that her entire existence might be a lie. But I remember my childhood, she protested. My parents, my friends, my school. I remember being ordinary. Memory modification technology has advanced considerably in the past 30 years, Dr. Yilan said gently, and if the human government wanted to hide these operatives, giving them normal lives with constructed memories would be the most effective approach. Sarah turned back to face him. So what happens now? Do you report this to someone? Do I get arrested? Nothing happens, Dr. Yilan said, which surprised her again. The border wars ended 30 years ago. If you are indeed Wraith 7, you've been living a peaceful life as a normal teenager. The Galactic Council has no interest in disturbing that. Then why tell me any of this? Dr. Yilan was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah got the impression he was choosing his words very carefully. Because strange things have been happening recently, he said finally. Ships have gone missing in the outer sectors. There have been reports of raids on remote colonies, but the attackers always disappear before any response can be mounted. The patterns are familiar. You think the hegemony is back? The hegemony as a political entity was dissolved after the border wars, Dr. Yelan explained. But their military philosophy never really disappeared. There are factions throughout the galaxy that believe superior force is the only way to achieve lasting peace. Some of those factions have been growing bolder recently. Sarah returned to her chair, feeling overwhelmed by information she couldn't fully process. What does this have to do with me? Probably nothing, Dr. Yelan admitted. You'll continue your studies, graduate, and go on to live whatever life you choose. But if your identity activation ever becomes necessary, identity activation? If the psychological conditioning that created your current identity were ever reversed, you would remember who you really are and what you're capable of. Sarah stared at him. And how would that happen? Dr. Yelan's expression became unreadable, usually through exposure to extreme danger, or through specific trigger phrases that were programmed into the conditioning. But Sarah, I want you to understand something very important. He leaned forward, his voice taking on an almost parental tone. If you are Wraith 7, then you are potentially one of the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy. The conditioning that made you into Sarah Martinez wasn't just about hiding your identity. It was about protecting everyone around you from what you might be capable of if that conditioning failed. The weight of his words settled over her like a cold fog. Sarah had spent her entire life feeling ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable. Now she was being told that her ordinariness might be the only thing standing between the galaxy and something terrible. What am I supposed to do with this information? She asked quietly. Live your life, Dr. Yelan said simply. Be Sarah Martinez. Study hard, make friends, find something you're passionate about, and hope that Sarah Martinez is all you ever need to be. But as Sarah left his office and walked back toward her dormitory, she couldn't shake the feeling that hope might not be enough. 3 weeks passed, and Sarah tried desperately to return to her normal routine. She attended classes, completed assignments, and participated in study groups with the same dedication she had always shown. But everything felt different now, as if she were watching her own life through a screen rather than living it directly. The other students seemed to notice the change. Marcus asked her repeatedly if she was feeling well, while Elena suggested she might want to talk to one of the Academy's counselors. Even some of the alien students, who typically paid little attention to human emotional states, began giving her concerned looks during shared classes. Sarah found herself studying her reflection in mirrors, searching for signs of the deadly operative Dr. Yelan had described. She looked exactly the same as always. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of face that would disappear in any crowd. If she was really Wraith 7, where were the signs? Shouldn't there be scars, or unusual muscle development, or at least some indication that she was anything other than an ordinary teenager? She also began paying closer attention to her physical responses, looking for hints of the extraordinary capabilities Professor Kethvar had described. During their weekly fitness evaluations, she monitored her heart rate, reaction times, and strength measurements. Everything remained stubbornly normal. She was reasonably fit for a human her age, but nothing about her performance suggested hidden abilities. The breakthrough came during what should have been a routine xenocultural studies field trip. Professor Unveiled, a scholarly being from the archive worlds whose species resembled living crystals, had arranged for the class to visit the Museum of Galactic History in the Academy's sister city. The museum housed artifacts from hundreds of civilizations, including several pieces that were considered too dangerous for public display but safe enough for academic study under controlled conditions. Sarah found herself standing before a display case containing weapons from the border wars. Most were clearly alien in design, energy weapons that looked like works of art, projectile systems that defied conventional physics, and armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. But in the center of the display sat a simple knife. It was unmistakably human in origin. The blade was a dark, matte metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The handle was wrapped in some kind of synthetic material designed for grip rather than appearance. Everything about it spoke of function over form, a tool designed by someone who understood exactly what it would be used for. That piece is particularly interesting, Professor Mavarin's translated voice said beside her. It was recovered from the Kepler 442b incident. Apparently it was the only equipment found at the site after the hegemony installation was destroyed. Sarah stared at the knife, feeling something strange stirring in the back of her mind. It wasn't quite a memory, more like an echo of a memory, as if someone else's thoughts were bleeding through into her consciousness. "Do we know who it belonged to?" she asked, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Unknown," Professor Mavarin replied, "but the metallurgy is fascinating. The blade is composed of materials that shouldn't be able to hold an edge, yet molecular analysis shows it's sharper than any conventional weapon. And notice the wear patterns on the handle." Sarah looked closer and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The synthetic wrap showed signs of long use, worn smooth in specific places that suggested how the weapon had been held. More disturbing, her hands seemed to know exactly how it would feel to grip it that way. "Professor," interrupted Sixandra, the draconian student, "why is this weapon considered significant enough to display alongside artifacts of galactic importance?" Professor Mavarin's crystalline structure shifted slightly, his species equivalent of a shrug. Because according to forensic analysis, this single weapon was responsible for approximately 60% of the casualties at the hegemony installation. Whoever wielded it demonstrated a level of skill that exceeded our understanding of human physical capabilities. The room suddenly felt too warm. Sarah could hear her heartbeat in her ears, and the edges of her vision seemed to be getting darker. She excused herself and made her way to the museum's rest area, where she sat on a bench and tried to control her breathing. That was where Marcus found her 20 minutes later. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, settling beside her with genuine concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," she lied. "Just feeling a little overwhelmed by all the history." Marcus studied her face with the kind of attention that came from growing up in the close-knit community of the Europa colonies, where everyone learned to read each other's emotional states. "You've been acting strange for weeks," he said gently. "Ever since that meeting with Dr. Yelan, did something happen?" Sarah almost told him everything. Marcus was probably the closest thing she had to a real friend at the academy, and keeping Dr. Yelan's revelations to herself was becoming increasingly difficult. But how could she explain that she might not be who she thought she was? How could she tell him that her entire identity might be a carefully constructed lie, designed to hide something terrible? "It's complicated," she said finally. "Try me." Before Sarah could respond, the museum's emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in pulsing red. An automated voice began speaking in Standard Galactic, its tone calm but urgent. "Attention all visitors. Please proceed to the nearest emergency shelter immediately. This is not a drill. Hostile forces have been detected approaching the academy. Please proceed to the nearest emergency shelter immediately." Marcus stood up immediately, his colony-bred instincts taking over. "Come on, Sarah, we need to get back to the academy." But Sarah remained seated, feeling something strange happening in her mind. The emergency lighting seemed brighter than it should be, and she could hear sounds that shouldn't have been audible. The hum of the museum's power systems. Conversations happening several rooms away, and something else. Something that sounded like ships in the upper atmosphere. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice seemed to be coming from very far away. She looked up at him, and for a moment he seemed like a stranger. Not Marcus Chen Williams, her study partner and friend, but a potential threat assessment. 5'10", approximately 160 pounds, no visible weapons, civilian clothing that would provide minimal protection, emotional state indicating confusion and mild panic. The thoughts weren't hers, but they felt natural, like remembering something she had always known. "Sarah, we need to move now," Marcus said, reaching for her arm. The moment his hand touched her, everything changed. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Sarah could see dust motes hanging in the air, could track the exact path of each pulse from the emergency lighting, could hear individual conversations happening throughout the museum. Her body felt different, lighter, stronger, more precise in every movement. She stood up in a single fluid motion that brought her to her feet without using her hands. A movement that should have been awkward but felt perfectly natural. Marcus stepped back, his eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been fear. "Sarah?" he said again. But this time his voice carried a different quality, as if he were speaking to someone he didn't recognize. Before she could respond, the museum shook with the impact of something massive hitting the building. Emergency barriers slammed down over the windows and the automated voice became more urgent. Hull breach detected in sections 7 through 12. Emergency protocols are now in effect. All visitors must proceed to emergency shelters immediately. Sarah's enhanced awareness told her exactly what was happening. 3 ships had landed on the museum's roof, and armed figures were cutting their way through the emergency barriers. She could hear their equipment, could estimate their numbers, and somehow, she knew exactly what they were looking for. They were looking for her. "Marcus," she said, and her voice sounded different even to herself. Calmer, more controlled, carrying an authority that had never been there before. "I need you to get to the emergency shelters and make sure the other students are safe." "What about you?" Sarah looked toward the museum's main entrance, where she could now hear the sound of cutting tools working through reinforced barriers. Her mind was calculating distances, timing and tactical options with a precision that would have terrified her an hour ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. "I think I'm about to remember who I really am," she said, quietly. The first explosion echoed through the museum, and Sarah Martinez began to disappear, replaced by someone else entirely. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Sarah Martinez was 17 years old, from a middle-class family on Earth, struggling with ordinary teenage problems. But underneath that carefully constructed identity was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, age 24, veteran of 17 classified operations, and the youngest person ever selected for the Wraith program. She remembered the training now, years of it, starting when she was barely 18. Physical conditioning that pushed human physiology beyond its theoretical limits, psychological preparation that taught her to compartmentalize trauma and function under impossible stress, technical skills that turned her body into a weapon more precise than any technology the galaxy had produced. Most importantly, she remembered her team. 6 other individuals who had been selected from across human space for capabilities that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. They had become something more than human, something that even their own government had been afraid to acknowledge. The museum's main entrance exploded inward, and Sarah's enhanced senses cataloged everything instantly. 12 attackers, heavily armed, moving with military precision. Their equipment was hegemony design, but newer, more advanced than anything used during the border wars. They weren't remnants. They were the next generation. Marcus was still standing beside her, frozen with shock and confusion. Around them, other students and visitors were screaming and running toward the emergency exits. But Sarah's tactical awareness told her that the exits had already been sealed. This wasn't a random attack. It was a carefully planned operation designed to capture specific targets. "Stay behind me," she told Marcus, her voice carrying a command authority that made him obey without question. She moved toward the weapons display, her body flowing with a grace that felt like remembering how to breathe. The case was reinforced, designed to withstand everything short of military-grade explosives, but Sarah's enhanced strength made quick work of the locking mechanism. The knife felt perfect in her hand. The grip settled into her palm like it had been made specifically for her, which it had. She remembered the process of having it crafted, the hours spent testing the balance and weight, the first time she had used it in actual combat. The attackers spread through the museum with professional efficiency, their leader speaking into a communication device in a language Sarah recognized as a hegemony military dialect. "Wraith 7 confirmed on site," he reported, beginning extraction protocol, so they knew who she was. More concerning, they had somehow known to find her here, which meant they had intelligence sources that went deeper than she had imagined. Sarah began moving through the museum, using her knowledge of the layout and her enhanced senses to stay ahead of the search teams. Her body moved without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over functions that Sarah Martinez had never learned, but Lieutenant Chen had drilled for thousands of hours. She needed to reach the communications center to warn the academy, but her path was blocked by 3 attackers who had positioned themselves with clear lines of sight across the main corridor. Under normal circumstances, crossing that space would have been suicide. Sarah Martinez would have hidden and hoped for rescue. Lieutenant Chen evaluated the tactical situation and chose a different approach. She moved. To an outside observer, her approach would have seemed impossible. She covered 30 meters of open ground in under 3 seconds, moving in a pattern that took advantage of shadows, reflective surfaces, and the brief gaps in the attacker's coordination. The first one went down before he realized she was there, the knife finding the weak point in his armor with surgical precision. The second attacker had time to raise his weapon, but human reaction times enhanced by the Wraith conditioning operated faster than most species could track. Sarah was inside his guard before he could fire, and he joined his companion on the floor. The third attacker was more experienced. He managed to get off 2 shots, both of which would have been fatal hits against a normal human, but Sarah's enhanced physiology allowed her to predict his aim and adjust her position, even as he fired. She felt the energy bolts pass close enough to singe her clothing, but her counterattack was already in motion. Marcus watched from his hiding place behind a display case, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The Sarah he knew was quiet, studious, and chronically average at physical activities. The person moving through the museum like a force of nature was something else entirely. Sarah reached the communication center and began working on the security console. Her fingers moved across the interface with practiced efficiency, accessing systems that should have required administrative clearance. Within seconds, she had established a connection to Academy security. "This is Wraith 7, she said into the communicator, using protocols she hadn't thought about in 3 years but remembered perfectly. "Museum under attack by hegemony forces. Estimate 12 hostiles. Military-grade equipment. Request immediate evacuation of all civilians and lockdown of Academy facilities." The response came back immediately in a voice she didn't recognize. "Wraith 7, this is Academy Control. We're reading your signal, but..." Wraith 7 was listed as inactive. "Reactivated under emergency protocols," Sarah replied. "Initiating defensive operations." She could hear more explosions from other parts of the building as the attackers began using heavier equipment to break through the museum's internal barriers. They were escalating, which meant they were on a timeline. Sarah made her way back to where Marcus was hidden, moving through routes that kept her away from the main search patterns. She found him exactly where she had left him, pressed against a display case and trying to process what was happening. "Marcus," she said quietly, and he looked up with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Who are you?" he asked. "That's complicated," she replied, "but right now I'm the person who's going to get you out of here alive." "Sarah, what's happening to you? You're moving like you're not human." "I'm still human," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. "I'm just remembering things I had forgotten." An explosion from somewhere above them shook dust from the ceiling. The attackers were getting closer, and Sarah's tactical assessment suggested they would reach this section within minutes. "Listen to me carefully," she told Marcus. "I'm going to get you to the emergency shelter. But you need to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you." Without asking questions, Marcus nodded, though she could see he was still struggling to reconcile this version of her with the person he thought he knew. "Sarah," he said quietly, "are you one of the good guys?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She remembered asking the same thing during her first briefing, when her commanding officer had explained what the Wraith program would turn her into. The answer then had been complex, full of necessary evils and acceptable casualties and greater goods that required terrible choices. Now, looking at Marcus's frightened but trusting face, the answer seemed simpler. "I'm trying to be," she said. More explosions echoed through the building, closer this time. Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of heavy boots moving through the corridors above them. The attackers had broken through the upper-level defenses and were making their way down. She checked her weapons, just the knife and whatever improvised tools she could find in the museum. Against 12 heavily armed attackers, it should have been hopeless odds, but Sarah Chen had faced hopeless odds before. And unlike Sarah Martinez, she remembered exactly how dangerous she could be when she stopped holding back. The hunt was about to begin, and for the first time since her conditioning had been activated, she was looking forward to it. The museum had become a hunting ground, and Sarah moved through it like she owned every shadow. Her enhanced senses painted a complete tactical picture in her mind. The attackers had split into 3 teams of 4, each covering a different section of the building. They were professional, disciplined, and well-equipped, but they were hunting Sarah Martinez, a 17-year-old student who should have been hiding in terror. They weren't prepared for Lieutenant Sarah Chen. The first team was advancing down the corridor that led to the ancient weapons exhibit. Sarah positioned herself above them, using the museum's architectural features to remain invisible until the perfect moment. The Wraith training had taught her to think in 3 dimensions, to use gravity and momentum as weapons just as much as her knife. She dropped down behind the last attacker in line, her landing silent as a whisper. The knife found its mark before he could even register her presence. His companions ahead continued their advance, unaware that their formation had just been compromised. The second attacker turned at the sound of his teammates' equipment hitting the floor, but Sarah was already moving. She flowed around his defensive position like water, using his own weapon as a shield against his squadmates while her knife disabled his armor's power systems. He dropped without firing a shot. The remaining 2 members of the team finally realized what was happening, but their training worked against them. They attempted to establish a defensive perimeter, taking positions that would have been perfect against a conventional threat. Sarah wasn't conventional. She used the museum's displays as cover, moving between ancient artifacts and cultural treasures with a precision that turned the entire space into her weapon. A crystalline meditation sculpture became a mirror to track enemy movements. A draconian ceremonial shield became a projectile that knocked one attacker off balance long enough for her to close the distance. Within 90 seconds, the first team was neutralized. Marcus watched from his hiding spot, his rational mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. The person moving through the museum bore only a physical resemblance to the Sarah he knew. Every movement was precise, economical, and devastatingly effective. She didn't fight like someone who had learned combat techniques. She fought like someone who had been rebuilt from the ground up to be a weapon. "Sarah," he whispered when she returned to his position. "What did they do to you?" "They made me better," she replied, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't sure if that was entirely true. Her enhanced hearing picked up radio chatter from the remaining attackers. They had found the bodies of the first team and were adapting their tactics accordingly. The easy part was over. Wraith 7 is active, the team leader was reporting. "Repeat, Wraith 7 is fully active, requesting immediate backup and authorization for lethal force." Sarah's blood ran cold. If they were requesting authorization for lethal force, it meant they had been trying to capture her alive. That changed everything about their tactical approach, and about what they might be planning for the other students. "Marcus," she said urgently, "I need you to get to the emergency communications panel near the main entrance."
"Can you do that?"
"I think so, but what about you? I'm going to make sure they don't have a chance to hurt anyone else." Marcus studied her face, seeing something there that he had never noticed before. Under the familiar features of Sarah Martinez was someone harder, more dangerous, and infinitely more competent than the teenager he thought he knew. "Be careful," he said. Careful was Sarah Martinez. She replied, "I'm something else." She moved toward the central atrium where the remaining 8 attackers were regrouping. They had learned from the fate of their advance team and were now moving as a single unit, covering each other's positions and maintaining constant communication. But they were still thinking like conventional soldiers, and Sarah Chen had been trained to exploit exactly that kind of thinking. The museum's central atrium was dominated by a massive holographic display showing the formation of the Galactic Confederacy. Sarah used the projection emitters to create visual distortions, turning the space into a maze of light and shadow that confused the attackers' targeting systems. She struck from above, using the museum's maintenance catwalks to get behind their formation. The knife found its targets with surgical precision, but now she was facing opponents who were ready for her tactics. The team leader was better than the others. He tracked her movement pattern and predicted where she would emerge. Putting 3 rounds through the space she occupied a fraction of a second before she arrived there. Sarah's enhanced reflexes saved her life, but barely. She felt the energy bolts pass close enough to burn her skin, and for the first time since her conditioning had reactivated, she felt genuinely threatened. The team leader was speaking into his communicator in rapid hegemony battle cant, coordinating his remaining forces to establish overlapping fields of fire. They were turning the atrium into a kill zone with no way out. Sarah Martinez would have been trapped. Lieutenant Chen had other options. She activated a protocol she hadn't used since the Kepler 442b operation, one that pushed her enhanced physiology beyond its normal limits. Her already accelerated reflexes doubled in speed. Her strength increased dramatically. Her pain tolerance reached levels that would have been medically impossible. For a normal human, the cost would be severe. This level of enhancement could only be maintained for minutes before causing permanent damage. but sometimes minutes were enough. She moved through the kill zone like she was teleporting, appearing and disappearing faster than the attackers could track. The knife became a blur of motion, finding gaps in armor that existed for milliseconds at a time. Within 30 seconds, 6 more attackers were down. The team leader and his remaining companion fell back to the museum's main entrance, where they had established a fortified position with heavy weapons and energy barriers. They were no longer trying to capture her. They were trying to survive long enough for their backup to arrive. Wraith 7, the team leader called out in accented Standard Galactic. We know what you are. We know what the human government did to you. Don't you want to know the truth about your conditioning? Sarah paused, crouched behind a display case containing artifacts from the archive worlds. The question hit closer to home than he could have known. The conditioning that made you into Sarah Martinez wasn't just about hiding your identity, he continued. It was about controlling you, making you compliant, making you forget that your own government turned you into a weapon and then threw you away when the war ended. Every word was calculated to destabilize her, to make her question everything she had remembered, and it was working. Sarah could feel doubt creeping into her mind, undermining the clarity that the reactivated conditioning had provided. You could come with us, the team leader offered. Learn the truth about what was done to you. Learn who your real enemies are. Sarah remained hidden, her enhanced mind racing through possibilities. She could feel the battlefield enhancement protocol beginning to take its toll on her body. Her hands were starting to shake, and her vision was developing the kind of tunnel effect that warned of imminent physiological collapse. But she could also hear something else. The sound of Marcus working at the emergency communications panel, trying to establish contact with Academy security. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. Whatever doubts she might have about her conditioning, whatever questions remained about her identity, she knew one thing for certain. She was not going to let these people hurt her friend. Sarah Chen emerged from cover like a force of nature, and the last 2 attackers discovered exactly why the human government had been afraid of what they had created. The final engagement lasted exactly 47 seconds. Sarah moved through the fortified position like physics was a suggestion rather than a law. The energy barriers that should have stopped her became stepping stones. The heavy weapons that should have cut her down tracked movement that was already history by the time they fired. The team leader was skilled enough to land a glancing hit that would have dropped most opponents. But Sarah's enhanced physiology treated the energy burn as a minor inconvenience. Her knife found its mark with the kind of precision that spoke of thousands of hours of training against impossible odds. When the last attacker fell, Sarah Chen stood alone in the museum's main entrance, breathing heavily but victorious. Around her, the evidence of the battle painted a story that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed it directly. 12 heavily armed, professionally trained operatives had been neutralized by a single person using nothing but enhanced human capabilities and a knife. But the victory came at a cost. The battlefield enhancement protocol was shutting down her system piece by piece. Sarah could feel her enhanced reflexes slowing, her strength ebbing, and her tactical awareness fading back to normal human levels. Worse, the psychological conditioning that had maintained Lieutenant Chen's personality was beginning to fracture. She was becoming Sarah Martinez again, and Sarah Martinez had no idea how to process what she had just done. Marcus found her sitting on the museum steps 20 minutes later, staring at her hands as if she had never seen them before. Academy security forces were swarming the building, and medical teams were working to stabilize the surviving attackers. Sarah, Marcus approached carefully, as if he were walking toward a dangerous animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. She looked up at him, and he saw both people in her eyes, the quiet, studious teenager he had known, and the deadly operative who had just saved their lives. I remember everything now, she said quietly. Sarah Martinez and Lieutenant Chen. But I don't know which one is real. Marcus sat down beside her, noting the way she automatically positioned herself to watch the approaches to their location, even while appearing relaxed. Maybe they both are, he suggested. Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Yilan emerged from a security transport and approached them with the measured steps of someone who had been expecting this moment for a long time. Sarah, he said, and the way he used her name suggested he was addressing both identities simultaneously. Are you injured? Physically, no, she replied. But the conditioning is unstable. I can feel Sarah Martinez and Lieutenant Chen competing for control, and I don't think they can coexist much longer. Dr. Yilan nodded grimly. The human government warned us this might happen if your conditioning was ever activated. The personalities weren't designed to merge, one was meant to completely suppress the other. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Does Sarah just disappear? That depends on Sarah, Dr. Yilan said, looking directly at her. The human government has offered to restore the conditioning that suppressed Lieutenant Chen. You could go back to being Sarah Martinez, with no memory of what happened today or what you're capable of. Sarah considered this option. Sarah Martinez had been happy in her quiet way. She had friends, goals, a future that didn't involve violence or classified operations. It would be easy to go back to that life, to pretend that none of this had ever happened. What's the alternative? She asked. You remain as you are now, Dr. Yilan explained. Both identities, both sets of memories, both sets of capabilities. But Lieutenant Chen's conditioning includes psychological modifications that were never meant to exist in a civilian environment. The enhanced aggression, the tactical thinking, the ability to compartmentalize trauma. These things don't turn off just because the mission is over. You're saying I'd be dangerous. I'm saying you'd be different, permanently different from the person you were 3 hours ago. Sarah looked at Marcus, trying to read his expression. She could see fear there, but also something else. A kind of fascination with this new version of her that he was still trying to understand. There's a third option, Dr. Yilan said quietly. The attack today wasn't random. The intelligence that led them to you came from sources we haven't identified. There are likely more operations being planned, more targets being selected. You want me to help hunt them down. I want to offer you the choice. The human government's Wraith program was officially terminated after the border wars, but the skills and capabilities you represent are still needed. Not as a weapon this time, but as a protector. Sarah stood up, testing her physical condition. The battlefield enhancement protocol had fully shut down, leaving her with the baseline enhanced capabilities of her original conditioning. She was still faster, stronger and more aware than any normal human, but she no longer felt like she could take on entire armies single-handedly. If I choose to help, she said, what happens to my life here? My studies, my friends, my chance at a normal future? That would be up to you, Dr. Yilan replied. The Academy would work with you to complete your education while developing your unique capabilities. You would become something new. Not quite the weapon Lieutenant Chen was trained to be, and not quite the civilian Sarah Martinez was conditioned to become. Marcus cleared his throat. Can I say something? Both Sarah and Dr. Yilan turned to look at him. I've known Sarah for 8 months, Marcus said. I've studied with her, eaten meals with her, talked with her about everything from xenobiology to our plans after graduation. And I've seen what she did today. He looked directly at Sarah, his expression serious but not afraid. The person who saved my life today wasn't a stranger wearing Sarah's face. It was Sarah, using abilities she didn't know she had to protect someone she cared about. The techniques were different. The capabilities were extraordinary. But the core motivation was exactly what I would have expected from the Sarah I know. Sarah felt something shift inside her mind, a sense of the two competing identities finding a way to coexist rather than fight for dominance. You think I can be both people? I think you already are both people, Marcus replied. The question is whether you're willing to accept that and figure out what that means. Dr. Yilan watched this exchange with the expression of someone whose long-term plans were finally coming to fruition. The choice is yours, Sarah, he said. But before you decide, there's something else you should know. He gestured toward the museum, where forensic teams were still working to understand exactly what had happened. The attackers weren't just after you. We've decoded their communications, and they had a list of targets across multiple worlds. Other enhanced humans who were conditioned and hidden after the border wars. They're hunting down everyone from the various black programs that were shut down when the conflict ended. How many others are there? We don't know. The human government classified those records so deeply that even they claim to have lost track of some assets. But based on the attackers' intelligence, there could be dozens of individuals like you scattered across the galaxy, living normal lives with no idea what they really are. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She looked at Marcus, who was watching her with a mixture of concern and trust that made her decision easier. If I do this, she said to Dr. Yilan, I want Marcus involved. He deserves to know what he's getting into, and I trust his judgment. That's highly irregular. Dr. Yilan, Sarah interrupted, and her voice carried an authority that hadn't been there an hour ago. I just neutralized 12 professional operatives using nothing but enhanced reflexes and a knife. I think we can bend the rules about what's regular. Dr. Yilan nodded slowly. Very well, but understand that this path leads to places we can't predict. You'll be walking into situations that don't have clear solutions, facing enemies who understand human capabilities better than humans understand them themselves. Sarah looked out over the academy grounds, where students from dozens of worlds were going about their daily lives, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. She thought about other enhanced humans scattered across the galaxy, living peaceful lives that could be shattered without warning. She thought about the choice between being Sarah Martinez, safe and ordinary and limited, or becoming something new and dangerous and necessary. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but it also felt like finally becoming who she was meant to be. When do we start? She asked. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the research vessel Harmony, watching the hyperspace distortions that marked the edge of the Kepler system. She wore a uniform that didn't belong to any official military organization, dark blue with minimal insignia, designed for function rather than ceremony. Her hair was shorter now, pulled back in a style that kept it out of her way during combat operations. The person looking back at her from the deck's reflective surfaces was neither Sarah Martinez nor Lieutenant Chen, but something new that incorporated elements of both. She had kept Sarah's curiosity and empathy, her love of learning and her genuine care for others, but she had also retained Lieutenant Chen's tactical awareness, enhanced capabilities, and the kind of practical competence that came from facing impossible situations and surviving them. Marcus joined her at the observation window, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a data tablet displaying their latest intelligence reports. The archaeological team on Kepler 442b found something interesting, he said, handing her one of the cups. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. Define interesting. Remember the hegemony installation that was destroyed 30 years ago? The one where you and your team supposedly fought impossible odds? I remember, Sarah said, though the memories were still fragmentary. The personality integration process had been only partially successful. She could access Lieutenant Chen's skills and training, but many of the specific mission details remained locked away. The archaeological team found evidence of a much larger facility than anyone suspected, not just a military outpost but a research center, and they were working on something that the official records never mentioned. Marcus activated the tablet's holographic display, showing a 3-dimensional map of the underground complex that had been hidden beneath the hegemony's surface installations. Enhanced human research, Sarah said, recognizing the facility layout from classified briefings she wasn't supposed to remember. Exactly. The hegemony had been capturing human prisoners and studying their emergency physiology responses. They were trying to replicate the effects artificially in their own soldiers. Sarah studied the map with the kind of attention to detail that had been drilled into her during her original training. They were reverse engineering the enhancement process, and based on what we found in their computers, they succeeded. At least partially. The implications hit Sarah immediately. The attackers at the museum. They weren't just using hegemony equipment, they were enhanced using hegemony modifications of human emergency physiology. Which explains how they knew to target enhanced humans specifically. Marcus continued. They understand our capabilities because they studied us for decades. Dr. Yilan's voice came from behind them, and it explains why they're hunting down the remaining enhanced individuals now. Sarah turned to see the Centaurian approaching, with the kind of expression that suggested bad news was coming. We've received reports from 3 more worlds, Dr. Yilan said. Enhanced humans attacked, their cover identities compromised, their conditioning either activated or destroyed. In each case, the attackers seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. Survivors? Sarah asked. 2. Both successfully defended themselves, but like you, they're now dealing with unstable personality integration. One has chosen to have her conditioning restored. She wants to go back to being a normal civilian. The other has agreed to join our operation. Sarah nodded. Over the past 6 months, they had built a small team of individuals like herself. Enhanced humans whose conditioning had been compromised, and who had chosen to use their abilities to protect others. It was dangerous work that existed in the gray areas between official military operations and civilian law enforcement. There's something else, Dr. Yelan continued. Intelligence sources suggest that the hegemony remnants aren't just hunting enhanced humans for elimination. They're trying to capture some of them alive. For what purpose? We believe they're attempting to create a new generation of enhanced soldiers, but using hegemony psychological conditioning instead of human methods. Warriors with human physical capabilities but hegemony military philosophy. The thought sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She had seen what human enhancement could accomplish when guided by protective instincts and ethical constraints. The idea of those same capabilities directed by hegemony militarism was terrifying. How many enhanced humans are still out there? Marcus asked. Unknown, Dr. Yelan admitted. The original programs were compartmentalized to an extraordinary degree. But based on our research and the intelligence we've gathered from captured attackers, we estimate between 30 and 50 individuals scattered across Confederate space. Sarah moved to the tactical display that dominated one wall of the observation deck. With practiced efficiency, she began plotting potential target locations based on population density, strategic importance, and accessibility. They're going to accelerate their operations, she said. Every successful defense we mount teaches them more about our capabilities, but it also makes them more desperate to achieve their objectives before we can organize an effective response. Agreed, Dr. Yelan said, which is why we're implementing the next phase of our operation. He activated a secure communication channel, and the display filled with the faces of individuals Sarah had never seen before, but somehow recognized. Enhanced humans like herself, but with different specializations and backgrounds. A former intelligence operative whose conditioning had made her invisible to most forms of detection. A combat engineer whose enhanced spatial reasoning allowed him to build or destroy almost anything. A medic whose understanding of human physiology bordered on the supernatural. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Yelan addressed the group. Meet your team. Sarah studied each face, her tactical awareness automatically assessing their potential capabilities and how they might work together. But more than that, she saw something else. People who had been through the same identity crisis she had experienced, who had made the same choice to use their abilities to protect others, rather than hide from what they had become. Our mission, Dr. Yelan continued, is to locate and protect the remaining enhanced humans before the hegemony remnants can capture or eliminate them. But more than that, we need to find the source of their intelligence and cut off their supply of information about our people. One of the faces, on the display, a woman whose file identified her as a former reconnaissance specialist, spoke up. Do we have any leads on their intelligence sources? One, Dr. Yelan replied. The attacks have been too precisely targeted to rely on external surveillance alone. We believe someone with access to the original enhancement program records is providing information to the hegemony remnants. A traitor in the human government, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Or someone who was supposed to be dead, Dr. Yelan said grimly. The enhancement programs produced individuals with capabilities that would make them extremely difficult to eliminate permanently. The implications of that statement settled over the group like a cold fog. They weren't just hunting hegemony remnants. They might be hunting one of their own. So what's our first move? Marcus asked. Sarah looked at the tactical display, her enhanced mind already running through dozens of scenarios and possibilities. 6 months ago, she had been a student worried about passing her xenobiology exams. Now she was planning operations that could determine the fate of enhanced humans across the galaxy. We do what Lieutenant Chen was trained to do, she said. We hunt. She turned to address the assembled team members on the communication display. But we do it as Sarah Martinez would want us to. Carefully, ethically, and with the understanding that we're protecting people who never asked to be weapons. The faces on the display nodded in understanding. They were all walking the same line between their enhanced capabilities and their humanity, between what they had been made to be and what they chose to become. Operation parameters will be distributed within the hour, Dr. Yelan announced. We begin with the Centauri colonies, where 3 enhanced individuals have been identified as high-priority targets. As the communication channel closed and the team members began their preparations, Sarah remained at the observation window, watching the stars that marked the edge of known space. Marcus joined her again, this time carrying operational gear instead of coffee. Any regrets? he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question. She thought about the quiet life Sarah Martinez could have lived, the normal problems and ordinary joys that she had given up when she chose to become something more dangerous and necessary. "Ask me again when this is over," she said. But even as she spoke, she knew the answer. She had found something in this new identity that neither Sarah Martinez nor Lieutenant Chen had possessed alone, purpose that combined compassion with capability, strength guided by wisdom rather than orders. The Harmony began its transition to hyperspace, carrying them toward their first mission. Behind them, the Kepler Academy continued its work of educating the next generation of galactic citizens. Ahead of them lay unknown dangers and impossible choices. Sarah Chen Martinez adjusted her equipment harness and prepared to become exactly what the galaxy needed her to be. Not quite human, not quite something else, but perfectly suited to